back to Talking Points. I'm your host, Dr. Stephen E. Gardner. And I'm here to share with you and to open up this whole brand new season on Talking Points. And so today we're going to talk about a particular topic and open up a brand new series that will help us to discover the unknown in the midst of what we already know. And so let's get right into it and find out what we have to learn here. This new series is called Hidden Figures, discovering the unknown in the midst of the known. And so what we're going to be talking about over the next few episodes is the goal, rather, is to uncover some truths that have been present all along. We all have had things that have always been there. You can drive past something in your car and look at something, and then one day you happen to walk by the same thing you drove by, and you notice there were some things that were there that you didn't recognize because you were traveling at a different rate of speed and in a different vehicle. And sometimes these hidden figures are there, and we just have to take the time to unearth them to be able to find out what we can learn from what we don't know that's already in the midst of what we do know. We also are going to talk about how these truths can liberate and transform the way we envision life, and in some of the most common and also in the uncommon areas of our life. And we have common and uncommon areas, and truths that are hidden have the potential to liberate and transform how we see and also how we respond or behave. I'm going to use, in this particular series, I'm going to talk about a biblical passage that's familiar to a lot of us. And from it, we're going to discover some hidden figures. Luke chapter 5, verses 1 through 11. And I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version. So if you have the King James or the NSAB or the English Standard Version, it may read a little bit different. But I'm going to read it from my version, and it says this. Once while Jesus was standing beside this lake of Gennesaret, which is also another term, another name for the Sea of Galilee, and the crowd was pressing in on him to hear the word of God, he saw two boats there at the shore of the lake. The fishermen had gone out of them and were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to put out a little from the shore. Then he sat down and taught the crowds from the boat. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into the deep water and let your nets for a catch." Simon answered, "Master, we have toiled all night and have caught nothing. Yet, if you say so, I will let down the net." And when they had done this, they caught so many fish that their nets were beginning to break. So they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help. And they came and filled both boats so that they began to sink. But when Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, "Go away from me, Lord, I am a sinful man." For he and all who were with him were amazed at the catch of the fish that they had taken. And so also were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. Then Jesus said to Simon, "Do not be afraid. From now on, you'll be catching people." And when they brought the boats to shore, they left everything and followed him. One of the first points that I'm going to bring out from this particular story is how faith is shown in the amount that you surrender. Faith is shown in the amount that you surrender. Did you know that the call of God reveals that Jesus had needs? As we can see here, Jesus had a need. And we often don't think about that in context. When we read the Bible, we see him as a son of God. We see him as someone that we follow. We see him as someone that we emulate. But we never think about the fact that what's revealed here in this passage, that Jesus had a need. And so he said to Simon, who owned this boat, "Let me borrow your boat. Allow me to use your boat just for a little while." And sometimes, we are inconvenienced sometimes when we need to surrender and show our faith. Faith does not always come in a neat package that says that everything is going to line up, but sometimes it comes in an inconvenient, inopportune time. So we think, so we have to trust. So in this case, blindly, Peter on the one hand was accommodating the request of Christ. But on the other hand, as things roll out, we're going to see something here that was revealed in the outcome of this interaction between Jesus, the disciples, and this catch of fish that we're going to talk about. So Jesus was also saying here, allow me to have a little space in your life. And sometimes the answer to our dis-ease, the answer to our discomfort, is just simply to allow Jesus to have a little space in our life. Sometimes we may have gone through life and he has been absent, at least from that interaction. Or he's been there all along, but I never delved into the chance to really get to know him better. So this story allows us to see that how God shows up in ordinary circumstances that we can get to know him better. And one of the points here is that in the midst of your ordinary circumstances, there's a God that wants you to get to know him, that wants you to get to know him better so that you can be better and also do better. So we find here that Jesus tells him to launch out into the deep. But before that, he wanted him to experience just a little bit of his involvement in his life. One of the truths we can learn from this, that before God gives us the big tasks, the big assignments, the bigger grace to do the things that he desires or that he wants us to do, to increase our capacity to do more, to be an impact in this society. He has to give us these small scrimmages of doing just a little bit. And sometimes what happens is those little bits that we feel like we should be doing a whole lot more because I feel that I'm more gifted than that. I feel that I should be recognized more for what I have by others. Yet in the backside of the mind of God, he allows us to scrimmage on the little things first. There is a passage in the Old Testament that says, "Despise not the days of small beginnings." And for Peter and his disciples, this was a small beginning when Peter lent his boat to Jesus to be used just a little bit. So now that Jesus used his boat, he began to teach the masses that were there. He began to expound the word of God to those who came there to the Sea of Galilee or the Lake of Gennesaret. Jesus is now finished using Peter a little bit. He has occupied a little bit of space in his life. But the Lord had something larger and greater in his mind. And in God's mind, the time was now for Peter's opportunities to be expanded, for his capacity to be enlarged, for his insight to be widened. And so we're going to see here. So we find out that he says, launch into the deep for a great catch. Now, I want you to do what Jesus is saying to Peter, what you've never done. Well, what are you talking about? Sometime before the best comes out, the worst comes up. Now, Jesus already knew the situation the disciples were in, but he's challenging them to do something that they are not familiar with, and we're going to go into that. Sometimes that when the call of God comes to us, again, it's not always convenient. And it may not always be what you imagine, but when you can trust God and have faith in God in the midst of what you have considered to be, outside the box, as it were, your faith is shown in the amount that you surrender. So let's look more closely here. So what we see here is that Peter said to Jesus, we've toiled all night and we've caught nothing. Let me talk about that for a moment. Peter and his crew had just been out there on the sea the night before. Now, some of you are fishermen and you know that if you really want to catch fish, sometimes you have to go early in the morning before the sunrise to be able to catch the fish. Well, this was their business. This was their industry. This was their enterprise. And they basically, what they were saying, we did not get paid because we didn't catch any fish. Or should I say, we're not going to get paid because we had no fish to market. And so, therefore, they came up short. Therefore, they come up empty-handed, doing what they were familiar with, doing what they would normally do. Before Peter came to the place of surrender, he told the Lord what the Lord already knew. What did the Lord know? I'm saying here that the Lord already knew that he didn't catch any fish last night. He already knew that he had came up short. He already knew that he now and his crew did not have any fish that they could market. So much more is revealed about Peter's perception of where he was, what he didn't have, and the methods that did not work. As I said earlier, sometimes the worst comes up before the best comes out. He probably struggled with that, knowing in his mind, we were just out here before. We was just here and we have been out here all night and you're going to ask me to do something. Yet Peter, after he got all of his arguments out, after he got all of his discomfort out, after he had voiced his complaint, he came to the precipice of saying, yet if you say so. Or as the King James puts it, nevertheless, at your word, I will. And there is a precipice in our life when our faith finally surrenders to the Lord's will. What we finally discovered in the midst of a hard spot was really a blessing in disguise. He had to come to the point that in spite of his exhausting work last night to come up short, in spite of it being broad daylight in a spot that probably wouldn't yield fish because they don't usually gather, he says, yet if you say so, nevertheless at your word, I will. So now let's talk about a little bit about the miracle of this catch. And there are miracles that we can imply from what we can see here that I think it kind of informs us that we can find ourselves in one of these situations or not. The first thing that we can speculate is the miracle of knowledge. Jesus knew the fish would be there. Let me say that again. Jesus knew that the fish would be there. So therefore, one way of looking at it, he sent them to a place he already was aware of that had a supply. He sent them to a place that he was already aware of that had the supply that they needed for their life. You may have not caught anything last night. You may have come up short last night, but I'm here to be your sufficiency in the midst of your insufficiency. We can also see that this could be the miracle of power. Jesus possibly could have willed the fish to be there. He knew that they were there, or he willed them to be there. You know, God can do anything that he wants to do. He can will certain things to happen in our life that we just did not have the ability or the sufficiency to provide. And this could have been one of those situations. When you experience the miracle of power, it could be one of those situations that Jesus willed for your healing to take place, willed for your breakthrough to happen, willed for the door to be open that no man could shut. The miracle of power. Another way of looking at this same story provides another hidden figure that we can see is the miracle of opportunity. The disciples' availability seized the opportunity. Sometimes in order to have the miracle of opportunity, you have to have availability. Let me say that again. In order for you to have the miracle of opportunity, you have to have availability. If I'm not available, there are things that you're just going to miss in life. And sometimes we become unavailable because of other interests. Sometimes we find out that in order to really to have those opportunities, you got to take time to be available, which means you have to get away. You have to separate yourself. You have to do something that you're not used to doing. You have to focus, in a different area. You have to focus in a different way. So the disciples' availability enabled them to seize the opportunity. Well, let's talk about the miracle of assignment. Could it be that Peter was destined for this catch, and this group of disciples were called to share in it? Another way of looking at it is like this. If he was unavailable, what was destined for him could have possibly be assigned to somebody else. So our availability puts us in the pathway of destiny. Our availability puts us in the pathway of destiny. Peter was destined for this catch. Not only was Peter, but also the group of disciples that were with him were called also to share in him. Another hidden figure that pops out here in this story is the miracle of the overflow. What was happening in the life of Peter was now shared by those who partnered with him. Now, there's two ways I want to look at that. on the one hand, Peter and his partners had all come up short. Peter and his partners did not catch any fish to market, so they were all in a place of need. On the other hand, because of Peter's obedience, not only did Peter experience the blessing, but also those who were in partnership with Peter, they also experienced the blessing. In fact, the scriptures reveal that they had such a great catch that it filled both of their boats to where they had began to sink. It's called the miracle of the overflow. They had more than enough. They saw and they experienced El Shaddai, the God who is more than enough. He showed up and surely he showed out in a way that they could never forget. See, the miracle of the overflow sometimes happens when you've hit rock bottom, when you've exhausted every avenue and you've exhausted all of your resources and you got no place else to look except to the God who has saved you, except to the Lord who has bought you with a price. The miracle of the overflow happened when Peter decided to look away from what he had come up short with and say, "Yet if you say so, nevertheless at your will, I will let down the net." And not only was he impacted by this great catch, his partners around him also were impacted to the point that was a miracle in their own life that gave them a testimony that they will never forget. That is the kind of God we serve. And those are the kind of hidden figures that do pop up in the common and uncommon places where God shows up in a way that we will never forget ever again. Another hidden figure that emerges from this text is the miracle of worship. The impact of the event resulted in an acknowledgement, that is Peter's acknowledgement of the lordship of Christ. He says he fell on his knees, a sign of open, overt worship of what was already going on in his heart. Sometimes God brings us into these awesome supplies in our life, these awesome miracles to bring us to our knees. That bringing us to our knees breaks us from our way of thinking about life, way of thinking about ourselves. We come down to a place of devotion and worship. And while we're in this place of devotion and worship on our knees, we come to a self-awareness and a confession. He fell on his knees and he said, "Lord, I am a sinful man." Sometimes the blessings and the benefits of God that show up in our life in a miraculous way brings us to the point of feeling unworthy of the blessing. And so this was part and parcel of what Peter experienced here. That his attitude of, "Lord, I haven't been able to catch anything," has now changed to a point that, "Lord, I've got so much here going on and I can't help but to think how unworthy I am of your blessing." But if it had not been for his obedience, he would not have experienced the blessing. Well, now I want to switch to something that I want to talk about as we move toward the latter end of our episode today. Occupation, transformation, and vocation. While worshiping in amazement, Peter and his crew received a word that transformed their occupation into a divine vocation. He tells them, "Henceforth, or from now on, you will be catching people." What he was saying here to this group of fishermen, through the miracle of the catch and their amazement and worship, he spoke a word that transformed them from being just fishermen into fishers of men. the question that I want to ask to everyone that's watching this episode of Talking Points: what are you being transformed into? Well, let's talk about the Sea of Galilee and what it represents. One way of looking at the Sea of Galilee, or the Lake of Gennesaret, is that the Sea of Galilee, in a metaphorical sense, can represent your sphere of influence, your circle of influence, your region, your boundaries, your relationships, as it were. And so what we find here, Jesus revealed to them while on the Sea of Galilee at least 3 important interests he had. Now you may find other ones, but I'm going to introduce these 3 in hope that you would draw from these 3. But I want to encourage you to go back and read this whole passage, this whole story about the miracle of the catch on your own terms. And maybe you can see some things that you didn't see before. Maybe there's some hidden figures, nuggets of truth and revelation that's there that can transform your life and empower you where? In your own sphere of influence. Here are 3 things that we can draw from this. He is interested, that is, Jesus is interested in you and yours. It's not just about you, but it's also about those that are connected to you as well. Jesus not only cares about you, but he cares about those that you have, that you're connected to. He cares about your sphere of relationships. That's important. And so, another thing we can think about here is that he's also interested in what you're good at. Now that's a huge statement. God is interested in what you're already good at. And some of us have this passion to be more. Some of us have this passion to do beyond what we have found ourselves doing over and over and over again. Yet God is interested in what you're good at, even if you're tired of it. Hello? God is interested in what you're good at, even if you are tired of it. Because that's a starting point of your surrender. That's a starting point of your walk of faith. That's your starting point from when your occupation and a word from God can transform you and transform it into a divine vocation. Sometimes if you want to find out where God wants to use you, look at what you're already good at. Don't try to look somewhere off into something that you have failed at or something that you're not good at, but look at first at what you are good at. And then maybe the things that you are good at and you interact with God with that, then maybe you might become better at what you're not so good at, because you gain something and gain strength and maybe gain some relationships that can help you deal with the things that you aren't good at. He's also interested in your sphere. And I've alluded toward this also in the first bullet point here. But when I talk about your sphere, here I'm not speaking of your partners, which is Peter and his crew. I'm not speaking of those colleagues that already are working alongside you, maybe in your business or on your job or in the church. But I'm talking about your friends, your family, and others, which could be community. He's interested in your sphere. And we can see that when he gave him this great catch, he was saying that, look, Peter, I want you to look that just like you have caught fish in an inopportune time, I'm also now at this time calling you to catch people in the same place that you're already familiar with. You're familiar with the water. You're familiar with being a fisherman. And so I want to use you in the areas that you're already familiar with. And I want to say to you that I want you to fish for people from now on, utilizing the same talents and gifts that you're already familiar with, which means that if you are a fisherman, you got to have a net or you got to have bait. And if we're going to be evangelistic, especially in this context, or engage in some form of outreach, as it were, or make an impact in community, in doing some sort of program, you got to be able to see that Jesus will work with you and that he's available. Are you available to be used in an area that you thought that you couldn't in times past, or that you didn't in times past? Well, there's a lot that can be taken from this particular story, and I mean, we can go on and on, but the whole idea is for that this first episode would be like yeast. That you would read it, draw from what's being said here, go back and read the story for yourself, and allow revelation, truths that are hidden, to begin to pop up out of the text that can transform your life and inspire you along your path, especially as you endeavor to do the things that he's called you to do. Let me say these 5 things that I want to talk about here as we wrap this up. The catch was at the right moment and at the right time of day. The thing we can learn here is the importance of God's timing in your own personal success. Some things that God's called us to do, but just because he's called you to do it doesn't mean it's the time to actually do it. So there's a difference between the calling and descending. And so what that means, that once you got the call and before you are sent, there's a time of preparation. There's a time of personal reflection. You can see that in other people's lives, like in the life of Joseph. Joseph thought that all that he went through was just against him, until finally at the very end, all that he had went through positioned him in a place to actually fulfill the dreams that he had. The importance of God's timing in your personal success. In this case, the catch was at the right moment, at the right time of day. The next takeaway is that sometimes God gives us a word from people unrelated to our profession. Let me say that again. Sometimes God gives us a word from people that are unrelated to our profession. That's like somebody, here you are an engineer, and here's someone that's not an engineer that tries to tells you about your job. The first attitude you're going to have is that you don't know anything about what I'm doing. But we can kind of see how that sometimes it's those opportunities whereby we hear words from people that are outside of our capacity or outside of our discipline or outside of our industry. They might have a word from the Lord. I've heard people that have been walking along and all of a sudden they talk to some homeless person on the street. And that homeless person gave them wisdom that they needed to hear at that particular time. And that homeless person might have went on and started talking about something else that didn't make any sense. But they said a word that was right now word that they needed to hear. So sometimes God gives us a word from people unrelated to our profession. In this case that we find in this passage, Jesus was a carpenter, yet he was telling Peter and his crew how to fish. Third point I want to bring out as a takeaway, Jesus calls us where we are already experiencing immense lack and failure. Jesus calls us when we are already experiencing immense lack and failure. And sometimes it's those episodes, let me just, dumb it down a little bit. It's those times of our life that we feel at our lowest point, that we need somebody to pick us up. And so we get a phone call, and here's somebody asking us to pray for them. And you feel like right now, I'm in a position that somebody needs to pray for me. Yet when you surrender, your faith that's displayed in your surrender opens the way for blessing, not only for you, but for the person that you are praying for on the other end. How many times has that happened to you? I know it's happened to me a few times. Well, I wind up praying for that person when I had a need of my own, and God came in such a way that I was benefited, I was blessed as well as them. So, what we learned there is that the sufficiency of God's presence is greater than our insufficiency. And one way to get in the midst of the sufficiency of God's presence is absolutely in the place of prayer. Fourth, Jesus calls us when we're tired of the mundane and devoid of purpose. You probably have said, there's got to be more to life than what I've ever experienced. Or, common that I hear among Christ followers and among Christians and churchgoers, there's got to be more to church than what I'm experiencing. Or maybe it's a job. Maybe it's an occupation. There's got to be more to my occupation than this. And that makes us ripe for the harvest. Ripe for God to really work with us in the midst of what we're already tired of, in the midst of what seems to be devoid of purpose. And lastly, sometimes we miss the indicators of purpose in what we're presently doing. Sometimes we miss the indicators of purpose in what we're presently doing. Remember when they were looking for a king, and David's father had picked all the other brothers to go and be anointed, and none of them fit the bill, yet it was this little ruddy boy out there shepherding sheep that was the right person for the right job. You would look at him and you'd say that he wasn't the right person. Sometimes it's what we're already doing is exactly where God wants to bless us, or should I say catapult us into our next assignment. Sometimes we miss the indicators of purpose in what we're already doing. Sometimes the mundane has blinded us from the blessing. Well, that's all we're going to talk to you about today in Hidden Figures Part 1. We're going to talk about Hidden Figures Part 2 next week. I'm not going to share with you what we're going to unearth, as it were, but I trust that you've been blessed today here on Talking Points. So glad to be back with you here in Season 2. We look forward to seeing you again on Talking Points right here next week. God bless.